I guess we'll go ahead and start then. I want to thank you all for being on today. This CMU Extension Forage and Livestock Hour. My name is Patrick Davis, Regional Livestock Field Specialist down in Stockton, Missouri, and I'll be hosting today. Our co-host will be Drew DeCall, and he's changed his name to Ask Questions here, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. Again, I want to thank you all for being on today. This presentation, in addition to being done through Zoom, this presentation is being simulcasted through YouTube, through the MU-IPM YouTube site, and we want to thank them for helping us to do this. It will also be saved there after the presentation, and so if you want to go back and look at the presentation or anything, it will be there for you. So again, we want to thank the MU-IPM group for doing that. So as far as questions, if you have questions, the best way to answer those the best way to ask those is through the chat. And so my chat is actually on the top of my screen right now, but sometimes it's on the bottom middle of the screen, sometimes it's on the top. But if you go to chat and you go to drop down menu, and Druba is our co-host, and he will take those questions and provide those to our speakers. And so you go down that drop down menu to ask questions here. If you want the question to remain anonymous, if you want the question asked to everybody in the group, just go into the chat and type the question in. But either way, we do like questions and information, and so if you have any questions or comments, put those in the chat. That's the best place to do that. So moving through here, what we're going to be talking about today, Dr. Pat Guinan with climatology. He's the Associate Extension Professor at MU in climatology, atmospheric sciences with MU Extension. He's going to provide a weather report. And then our main speaker today is going to be Wesley Tucker. He's an ag business field specialist with MU Extension. And he's going to talk about, do I feed through the drought, or do I sell cows now? And so with that, Dr. Guinan, are you ready to take over?
I am, yes. Thanks, Patrick, and good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah,
I'll get right into it. And since we last met a couple weeks ago, these are on the left was the drought monitor map from 2 weeks ago for Missouri, and compared to the one that just came out this morning. So you can see we've had improving conditions across southern Missouri. They've been getting some rains over the past few weeks, and that's been very helpful in regard to mitigating the impacts of the drought we've seen across much of southern Missouri that started up earlier this summer. Better conditions in August and into the first part of September. On the other hand, the northern half of the state's not looking so much better in regard to worsening conditions, especially across northern Missouri. We're starting to see moderate to severe drought impacting the northeastern corner of the state. Abnormally dry conditions and depicted here in parts of Atchison and Holt counties, Nottoway County. There's some dryness that's emerging. I do want to focus here and look at west central Missouri, extending from Boone County all the way to Jackson County. There is a narrow corridor of dryness, but it's intense and it's severe, and we are seeing impacts because this has been ongoing for much of the summer. We just can't shake. We just haven't been getting the rains that they've been getting recently across southern Missouri, and so we have moderate to severe drought. Again, from Boone County to Jackson County, that covers the city of Columbia, and I can testify just how dry it is. We've had we've had just over 5 inches of rain since early June, so 3 months, just over 5 inches of rain, when typically we should have about 15. So that's a 10-inch deficit right during the heart of the growing season. And so some impacts are obviously ongoing. Hopefully we'll get some rain soon, but unfortunately it doesn't look notable, at least over the next week or so. So better conditions across southern Missouri. We have emerging drought across northern sections, and then this persistence area of drought across west central Missouri. This is the radar estimates over the past couple weeks. Again, you could see these heavier rains that have been impacting southern Missouri. Very nice to receive. They're actually starting to get some renewed grass growth. Things are getting greener. The ponds have stopped taking that direction of going dry. They're actually starting to get a little bit of more water in them because of these rainfalls they've seen over the past several weeks. But again, that dryness. So this area of blue is less than a half-inch of rain. Most areas have seen not much rain over the past couple of weeks, and so the dryness continues, especially northeast, north central, and parts of western Missouri, west central Missouri. On the right, these are actual rain gauge reports from COCORA's observers. You can see where the rains have been falling. Look at some of these totals, over 5 inches here in Stone County, over 7 inches of rain just over the past couple of weeks. Obviously, that's very helpful in regard to replenishing those surface water supplies, and as well as water supplies below the ground, the groundwater conditions. These are some of the actual totals, the heaviest amounts I could find. I talked about Stone County, over 7 inches just north of Cape Fear, Missouri, Lawrence County, Greene County. These are all southwestern counties that have been getting some decent rainfall. Even parts of far south central Missouri, over in Ozark and Howe County that had over 5 inches over the past couple of weeks. And these much lower totals across northern Missouri and parts of west central Missouri, where we could really stand to see more rainfall. Temperatures over the past couple of weeks sort of flipped in regard to, when you have a drought during the growing season, especially during the summer, you have not much moisture in the soil profile. And so you provide an opportunity for that air to heat up a little bit more efficiently. You almost get a desert-like environment where you get these hotter temperatures. So we had hot temperatures in June and July across southern Missouri when there was an ongoing drought. With the rainfall, that's mitigated those hot temperatures from going out of control. And so much more seasonable weather conditions, slightly above average across the southern half of the state. Where it's been drier, we see those warmer conditions running 1 to 4 degrees above average. And so that's what we're experiencing. That's the impact you have on temperatures. When things start to dry out, you start heating up. And that's what we're seeing across the northern parts of the state with those warmer temperatures. As of about 10 minutes ago, looking at Missouri Mesonet data, you can see temperatures are running pretty decent, pretty seasonable for this time of year, generally running into the upper 70s, even and mid to upper 70s across the state. Dew points, this is also a very important variable to measure, because you combine temperature and dew point, you get heat indices. These are not too bad. It can be a lot worse this time of year. Generally running in the upper 50s or lower 60s from about 10 minutes ago. A little bit more humid conditions down in the Boot Heel. The forecast over the next few days, it does look fairly pleasant. We've had some nice weather in regard to the temperatures, not being too hot like they've seen out west over the past week or so. Generally, highs today are expected to be in the middle 80s. That is going to be the same for tomorrow. A little bit hotter conditions, again, across that drier area of northwestern parts of the state. They might get into the upper 80s, low 90s tomorrow. And then on Saturday, we have a frontal boundary moving in from Iowa. That'll bring a little bit more clouds, cooler conditions across northwest Missouri. There's another system moving in from the south that could bring more clouds and a chance of showers across southeast Missouri tomorrow. And right here, we're going to be sandwiched in between those systems, a little bit more sunshine with highs in the middle 80s on Saturday. So for the most part, the temperatures look pretty good over the next few days. And the low temperatures look very pleasant. Tomorrow morning into Saturday morning, generally lows in the upper 50s and low 60s. Very, very nice mornings for the next few days. On Sunday, we are having that cold front moving through pretty much the rest of the state. It's a fairly strong cold front in regard to the temperature contrast. Sunday morning, we'll see lows in the middle 50s, low to middle 50s across northwest Missouri. And as that front progresses southeastward through the state, look at these high temperatures on Sunday, not getting out of the 70s, even perhaps barely able to make it to 70 on Sunday. So it's going to be very fall-like on Sunday. It'll be notable with that northerly wind blowing in those cooler temperatures. Looks like just a very nice day on Sunday, temperature-wise. And here's pretty much the schematic showing that cold front moving through on Saturday night into Sunday, bringing those chances of showers. I think the best chances of showers statewide will be on Sunday. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like much accumulation in regard to those showers where we need it fairly badly, especially across about the northern half of the state. This is the forecasted precipitation over the next 7 days, showing those lighter totals. It looks like the best chance again will be Saturday night into Sunday, perhaps a quarter to a half inch of precipitation on the Iowa-Missouri border. Obviously, if you're under one of those heavier thunderstorms on Sunday, you might get a localized heavier amount, but I think most people will miss out on those heavier totals. This is generally and much lighter totals as you go across southwestern parts of the state. It looks like the heaviest amount of rainfall with the better dynamics with the system will be across Iowa, anywhere from 1 to as much as 3 inches of precipitation over the next 7 days are forecast to fall across much of Iowa. This is the forecast for next week. That'll take us Tuesday through Saturday. It does look like those cooler conditions early in the week with highs in the 70s, perhaps low 80s on Monday and on into Tuesday. That will shift eastward with that upper level low moving to the east, and then another ridge of high pressure building across the Central Plains will bring in above average temperatures as we go into the middle and latter part of next week. So I would think highs could well be into the 80s, perhaps even lower 90s as we get into the latter part of next week, especially across the northwestern half of the state. It looks like the highest likelihood of above average temperatures for next week. Unfortunately, it does look like the faucet will be turning off for much of next week as well, with those warmer conditions and an enhanced likelihood of below normal temperatures. Patrick, that's pretty much a weather report. I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Drew, was there any questions?
No questions so far, Patrick. Thank you.
And thank you, Pat, for the weather report and for your continued support and help with this program. With that, we'll move on. Wesley will talk about, do I feed through the drought or sow cows now? So Wesley, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate the opportunity. Pat, I was hoping you'd give me a little bit better information. We all worried about spreading fertilizer the last few weeks. I was hoping he was going to tell me we'd get a little bit more rain, but I guess it is what it is. This is an interesting topic. Do I feed through drought or sell cows now? And I think you're going to see why a lot of producers are asking this, partially because the situation is very, very similar to what it was in 2012. And I remember just talking to a producer yesterday that basically said, you know, I about broke the bank trying to survive 2012, but then I made more money in 2013, 14, and 15 than I'd ever made in my life. And so I think that is essentially the question that a lot of producers are asking. I do want to point out, I am not just an ag economist with the university. I am also a cattle producer. So I'm facing this exact same dilemma that many of you are as well. And I've been trying to decide how many cows to try to hold on to going through this coming winter, because my county was hit pretty hard there in the middle of summer. And to me, this year was much worse than 2018. We weren't quite back to as bad as we were in 2012. But this has been a pretty rough summer. Thinking about it, basically any market comes down to supply and demand generally. From a supply standpoint, this is the Cliff Notes version of my presentation I'm about to give. But from a supply side, we're in pretty good shape. Long term, the cow numbers have been declining. Short term, however, drought is pushing more beef production on the market, but we're about to work our way through that. So from a supply standpoint, we're in good shape. Demand, both domestically and internationally for exports, beef demand is really, really good right now. However, there are plenty of risk out there. Number one being the drought is still with us. We've had some improvement, as Dr. Guinan just showed us, but the drought is still with us. We've got some global trade uncertainty that I'll mention briefly. And then inflation. How do we deal with inflation in the coming years? Does that push us into a recession? And how does that affect our American consumers' ability to purchase beef and pay more for it? And then just the reality that input costs are higher across the entire board. So, every time I've given an Outlook presentation, pretty much in the last 3 years, I've come back to the thing of, I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of the term black swan. If you go back to 3 years ago, in August of 2019, was when that Tyson packing plant had the fire at Holcomb, Kansas. And I had to give an Outlook presentation the very a couple of days after that. And I showed this slide here. So I went back and grabbed it. I don't ever remember in the markets a day that a live cattle futures opened the day after that fire. The market opened limit down and never moved one iota. The next day after that, it opened the expanded limit down, tried to bounce just a little bit off of it, but then went crashing right back down to the expanding limit and stayed there. So in 2 days' time, we had lost the limit and expanded limit out of the futures board. Just tremendous effects on the market. It took us about 6 months. We were about to work through some of the impacts of that packing plant fire. And then boom, we went right into March of 2020. We went in right into the pandemic. And so that blue line, that light blue line is the, weekly slaughter numbers for 2020. And you can see as we got into May there, whenever the pandemic worked its way into the middle part of the country, just how much our slaughter capacity declined simply because workers were sick and not being able to show up for work and take care of things. And so whenever you lose that much slaughter capacity overnight, it has had basically an impact on the market for about 18 months. Because when we could not slaughter those animals, essentially we could not put more animals into the feed yard that needed to go. So that black line there is our placements. We simply couldn't put the animals in the feed yard that needed to go. We couldn't get the ones out of the feed yard that were ready. And so essentially it has taken us about 18 months to work through that backlog of cattle, of how it really messed up our placements and our ability to get cattle slaughtered in a timely fashion. The good news is, here in 2022, which is that red line, slaughter weights are finally starting to go down below year-ago levels. And so we are finally starting to get more current in the market, and things are starting to improve from that standpoint. So, we keep just kind of thinking that about any time prices are just about to absolutely explode and become really, really good. But again, every time we turn around, something else seems to happen to us. We suddenly overnight we have a war between Russia and Ukraine. And to be honest with you, that hasn't affected the price of beef, essentially. But what it has done is it's affected the price of our fertilizer. It's affected the price of our corn. It's affected a lot of other things. And as the price of fuel has increased, it's increased the cost of everything else. So we have other consequences from that, even though it didn't directly affect the price of our cattle. But the thing, the external black swan, whatever you want to call it, that I want to kind of camp out on a little bit is to just kind of think about how the drought has been impacting us. As Dr. Guinan just showed, if we look at this week's drought monitor, it looks a whole lot better than it did just a month ago. Just a month ago there, in Southwest Missouri, where I'm from here in the Ozarks, I mean, we were really, really hurting a month ago. Thankfully, we've gotten some of those rains that some of the rest of the state hasn't, but it has improved for us. But I want to back up and just show today, this week's drought monitor compared to where it was 90 days ago, 3 months ago. 3 months ago, not one single county in Missouri was even the lightest of yellow of abnormally dry. So we haven't been dealing with the drought nearly as long as the western half of the United States has. They have been dealing with it not only in 2022, but in 2021 and 2020. The western part of the United States has been dealing with drought for a period of several years now, and that has been impacting our cattle numbers. This is the number of animals in the feedlot, and that red line is 2022. And so you might ask, whenever we've been saying, well, our beef cow numbers are going down, how can we possibly continue to have more animals in the feedlot than when cow numbers are declining? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, realize it takes a while, once a cow has a calf, and it takes a couple of years there for that to work through the system. And so we still have some of those higher calf numbers from some of those higher calf crops in previous years working through the system. But we also, because of that drought for the last several years in the western part of the country, we have been pulling more cattle forward. We've been putting more heifers in the feedlot. We have been pulling lighter weights into the feedlot. And so as you can see, we've been having very, very high numbers of animals in the feedlot simply because of many of the drought effects. So short term, it actually puts more beef on into the production system and onto the market. But long term, it has a very different effect, doesn't it? So this graph is basically looking at the number of beef cows that we have in the United States on January 1, what percentage of those, how many of those are slaughtered in the first half of the year. So the January to July slaughter as a percentage of how many animals, beef cows we had January 1. And as you can look, it goes up and down and it cycles through time. But for the last 32 years, we have averaged 5.5%. So, we've slaughtered 5.5% of the cows, beef cows that we had in inventory January 1. Well, look at this next to the last dot. I don't know if you guys can see my pointer, but look at this next to the last dot, January 20, or the first 6 months of January 21, how much higher it was. And then look at this, the last dot, January, the first 6 months of 2022. Look how much higher that is. We, in the first 6 months of this year, we've slaughtered 14.1% more than the previous 32-year average. And, we are sending cows to slaughter our production system at a very high rate. That's something that's been common in the news. We all know that, sending a lot of beef cows to slaughter, especially out of drought-stricken counties and areas where people just don't have the feed resources and can hold on to them. And I know a lot of producers that have had to sell large amounts of cows or even completely liquidate their herd. But a piece of that puzzle that you probably have not heard very much about is not only are we slaughtering cows, if I look at the number of animals in the feed yard, how many of those are steers versus heifers, the percentage of those that are heifers has been running at a very high rate for the last 3.5 years, even much higher than the period of 2009 to 2012, when we had that huge liquidation of the herd. We've been running much higher percentages of heifers in the feedlot, even than we did back during that period. So much of this is because of the drought, because the western part of the country has been experiencing drought before we did. But not only that, the economics just simply weren't there. The cattle prices weren't, high enough to encourage people to save heifers and to keep more. So, if a guy with 100 cows that normally might have kept 15 heifers, he might not have kept any last year, or he might have only kept 6 or 7 rather than 15. We just simply haven't had the conditions, whether it be because of the drought or because of profitability, to encourage people to keep more females. And I remember Dr. Ron Plain, one of my mentors, used to always make the statement that he said, there's very few guarantees in life, but I can guarantee you that a beef cow or beef heifer that is slaughtered this year, I guarantee you she will not calve next year. So the reality is we are looking at much smaller calf crops in future years, because we have simply slaughtered our production factory. We've slaughtered our production factory, being the cow or heifer, at a very alarming rate. So what does that mean for our number of beef cows going forward? That next to last dot there is the 2023, January 1 of 2023. And as you can see, we are actually forecasting this coming January that our beef cow numbers will be very, very close to as low as they were when we came out of the last major liquidation phase and finally started to turn around and save a few animals there in 2014. And depending on what we do the last 6 months of this year, how aggressive producers continue to be, we could be as low as that 29 million head, or very, very close to it. And then how low do we go, in the next year beyond that? So beef cow numbers are going to be very, very low going forward, which means smaller calf crops, which hopefully means higher prices. And, not only is this happening here in the United States, but also one of the things that's been impacting our market is just look at how Australia has been struggling to try to get their beef cow because of their extended drought. It's going to take them many, many years before they get back to the beef cow numbers that they were as little as 10 years ago. So that has also been impacting our market. So not only are we down on beef cows, but Australia, New Zealand, and those other countries over there as well. So what does that mean for prices going forward? Well, if you look back at the first half of this graph, prices would go up and down throughout the year, but we were kind of continually cycling lower. This is the finished cattle, slaughter cattle price, and we were kind of, unfortunately, constantly moving lower. Well, thankfully, thereafter, the mid part of 2020, we actually turned the corner and have steadily increased. And USDA is actually projecting an annual average, so the entire year average of $1.54 next year for finished cattle. So if that is the annual average, you can think about in the spring when we hit grilling season, we could see prices well above that. So that's created a lot of optimism in the market. But I also want to remind you at one of the very first slides, I said there are always risks. All right, there's always risks. So we think things are looking pretty good going forward, but there are always risks. So this is just thinking about our export value, that red line being 2022. And I just want to point out how many millions of hundreds of dollars that we have that comes through beef exports. So every calf that we sell, all right, a percentage of that is being bid by the buyer because of the export value that gets sent overseas. All right. And the other thing is our customers for those are changing. So this is countries that import beef. The green line is United States. We still import a lot of beef. We import a lot of lean, low quality beef that ends up in fast food hamburgers. We export a lot of high quality beef, which that is that black line to Japan and South Korea. That's their imports of beef. The yellow line is the countries of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, how much beef they import. And the red line is essentially all other countries in the rest of the world. The thing I'd like to point out by this is if you look back as little as 10 years ago, China essentially imported almost no beef. They were pretty self-sufficient with pork. The last 10 years, a lot of that has changed. Part of that because of ASF, part of that with their economy and different things like that. But now they import more beef than the rest of the world, other than Japan, South Korea, and the United States. So I point this out to just think, always realize we live in a global society today. So we see how dramatic the impacts because of fuel price and fertilizer prices and grain prices that we've had because of Russia and Ukraine. If we have anything go awry with China, we start thinking about sanctions with China, the impact on ag commodities across the board could be quite substantial. But even that is not nearly as big a risk factor in my mind as I think about our domestic economy and think about how our American consumer goes forward. This is a graph that basically depicts the black line is personal consumption. So what our consumers, how much money they spend. And the green line that's very closely mirrored most of it is their disposable income. So how much income they have versus how much they can spend. And basically, as you see, as their income goes up, they spend a little bit more. As their income goes down, they spend less, all the way until you get there till 2020. And we essentially at that time sent them home and said, we don't want you going out to eat. We don't want you going on vacation. We don't want you spending any money. Well, no, we didn't say we didn't want to spend any money, but we said we don't want you going anywhere where you can spend any money. However, we're going to pump a whole bunch of money into the economy in the form of stimulus. So disposable income shot way up, but personal consumption, the bottom fell out of it. So then that turned around in 2021 and all the stimulus went down, no longer was there. But yet people finally, whenever they had all this pent up demand, when they were able to get back out and do something, and their spending went way, way up. Isn't that the basic definition of inflation? Too much money chasing too few of goods. And so we actually look at that divide that our consumers are spending way more than their actual disposable income that they have access to be able to do that in this day and age. And so I think that has a lot of implications for as we move forward. What happens? How do we deal with this inflation that we're facing right now in this country? You know, can we control inflation without pushing the economy into a broader recession? That is one of the big risk factors that I do have concerned about right now. As I said, we are in the driver's seat that the American consumer really likes beef and is willing to pay for it. But what happens whenever if they start losing their jobs, or they're, because of inflation, they no longer have as much money. They're spending more money on fuel and housing. They can no longer spend as much money on food. I think that's a risk factor that we have to look. Now, thankfully, our numbers are going to be down. So at least if we were ever going to face a time of lower demand, that the consumer backed away from us a little bit, at least our numbers are going to be down. So that we're in a better position to handle it versus if we were in expansion mode. But this is just a risk factor that I want to throw out there. But for the time being, prices are much higher than they were last year and in previous years. So this is, the 4 to 5 weight calf, that blue line being 2022. If anyone sold anything recently or looked at the markets recently, prices are substantially higher than they were this time last year. And what does that mean going forward for us? Well, this is our forecast. The black line being our feeder steers, or lightweight feeder steers, actually 5 to 550 pounds. The yellow line being that finished steer price. And, I remember whenever in 2016 and 17 and 18, after we were recovering from the dramatic drop in prices from 2014 and 15 and saying, guys, the glory days are over. We're never going back there. Well, amazingly, we're forecasting prices going back, maybe not back to those $3 calves, but not that far back off of it. We're forecasting some really good prices going forward. So this leads me back to my question of, do I feed through drought or do I sell cows now? How much can I afford to spend to hold on to my cows and make it through this winter if this is the price forecast going forward? Well, one of the things I want to caution you about is look at that next to the last black line, 2023's forecast for calf price. It's really, really good. But then I'm going to show you the LMIC's, the Livestock Marketing Information Center's forecast for profit. That next to the last bar there is their forecast for profit in 2023. And you might say, well, if prices are so much higher, why is that forecast for profit not much higher than it is? Well, realize higher prices don't always turn into higher profits. And the reality is, because of the inflation that I just mentioned, everything that we buy today is more expensive. Our fertilizer is more expensive. Our feed is more expensive. Any tractor is more expensive. Any part is more expensive. Trying to hire labor is more expensive. Our costs are dramatically higher than they were even 6 months, 12 months, definitely prior to the pandemic. Our inflation adjusted costs are so much higher. They've increased so substantially that just because we got higher prices going forward does not necessarily mean we're going to have higher prices. So this is probably not a very flashy slide, but I would say this is probably, in my opinion, the most important slide in my presentation. Do I feed through drought or sell cows now? Well, unfortunately, anytime you ask an economist a question, often then they will respond, well, with an it depends. Well, I think it does depend on you and your situation and on your cost of production. Today, here in September, we are essentially about 220 days till spring. So we still have over half the year ahead of us until we get to spring grass next year. Depending on how far north versus how far south you are, whether you're an early April turnout or a late April to May turnout. But essentially, we've still got over half the year, over 7 months until we get to spring green up. I think you need to do two things. I think you need to calculate your cost that it's going to cost you to get through this winter. I think you need to seriously evaluate how much feed do I have, and can I even source the feed to get me through to next spring? And if I can source it, at what cost is it going to be to get me there? How much is it going to cost me per day to get there? Is it going to be $3 a day? Is it going to be $4 a day? Depending on how much you have to pay to source that, if you do not have adequate feed supplies at this point, it's going to be very, very expensive. But the other piece that I think most people aren't stopping to think about is I think you really need to do some number crunching and think about what my break even is going to be beyond 2022 for 2023 and 2024. What those years that I've forecasted those much higher prices, I think you need to really stop and think about what is my cost of production going to be going forward. If I am someone that depends on a lot of iron, a lot of equipment, I don't think the cost of a tractor is going down next year just because maybe the drought improves. How much diesel do I require? How much fertilizer do I require? How much labor do I require? Other inputs. If I am someone that depends on a lot of these inputs, we have seen fertilizer come down some. We have seen fuel, at least gas, come down. Diesel hasn't come down too awfully much, but we've seen a little bit of moderation in some of those things. But the reality is, if you don't believe those things are going back to pre-pandemic levels, which I'll be honest, I don't think they are, especially not equipment and things like that. If I'm someone that is highly dependent upon a lot of those, unfortunately, my break-even cost is going to still be pretty high going forward. So even with higher prices, my margin may not be that much better. And if my margin is not that much better, if I'm not looking to be very profitable in 2023 and 2024 based on higher prices, if my costs are eating up those higher prices, then I may look at being more aggressive now in my culling strategies and getting a few more animals to get me back in a place where I can get to a better efficiency and get my cost of production down a little bit lower. Now, if I'm someone that is a pretty low cost producer now, and I don't need a lot of those higher priced inputs going forward, then I may be willing to spend a little bit more money to get myself through the coming months, because I'm thinking that my margins are going to be much better going forward. I think the deciding how many cows to try to take through a drought-stricken area for me in 2022 depends a lot on what I feel like my cost of production is going to be in the future, not just this coming winter. Okay. And one of the reasons why I say that is this drought, I've been through a lot of series of drought meetings in my career with Extension. And I really feel like this year is just different. I go back to 2018 was the last time we traveled the state doing drought meetings. And it was very obvious. If I look, this is the drought monitor from August of 2018. At that time, Missouri was very much suffering from drought, but the rest of the Midwest was not. All right. So we had a lot of low cost alternatives at that time. There was lots of cheap silage around. You could balance a ration based on number 2 yellow corn. I remember Dr. Bailey said the other day that you could buy a ton of soy hull pellets almost for the price that you could buy a bale of hay for in some places. And so we had a lot of low cost alternatives. And at that time, it simply come down to figuring out what the per pound of energy, or TDN, was for these different alternatives. But you did have to look at, did I even have the logistics to be able to feed them? I remember in 2018 telling an elderly lady, widow lady that was trying to figure out how to feed her cows, that said, hey, I can tell you feeding number 2 yellow corn is your cheapest option in your area. but I'm not going to tell you to go out and feed 10 pounds of corn to your cows today, because that's not smart for you with your health conditions. So, at that time, we did have a lot of these discussions of investing in infrastructure, investing in feed handling equipment and hay handling equipment, and all of those types of things. Because see, in 2018, based on this drought monitor, it was very much like most droughts, which are that a drought occurs, feed and hay gets expensive, and then when the drought goes away, the costs go back down. Unfortunately, I don't think the costs are going to necessarily go back down just because the drought improves. Maybe the cost of hay goes down, but it doesn't necessarily even mean the cost of corn is going to go down until we get something settled with Russia and Ukraine and some of these different types of things going on in our world. So if our cost is going to stay higher, then I think this is really a time to think about, how do I get my house in order to be able to prepare myself to be profitable going forward, okay? Now, the other thing I want to point out is I do not see any time in history where we have had record levels of cow slaughter, but also had very good slaughter cow prices. I mean, that is a gift that we have been given based on the market situations, based on Australia, based on a lot of different factors. Prices for slaughter cows are very, very good still yet going into the fall, much better than in a normal year, much better than we would have experienced in a drought year going forward. So if we do need to aggressively cull, at least we're being rewarded for it financially and given more cash that we can invest in the remaining animals that we try to keep. Now, don't lose sight of all the different management things. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but we know there's all kinds of different things we can do, like early weaning that reduces, the cow's nutrient requirements by 30 to 40% just by simply removing that calf. So essentially, basically by doing that, we can dramatically extend the amount of feed that we have for the cow herd. Preg checking to get rid of those open cows or those late bred cows. Now's the time to do preg checks and maybe try to get back down to a smaller calving window so I can get a more uniform calf crop. Sorting cows into groups, young and old cows and thin cows into a group that need more feed versus the old boss cows that really don't need it because they're in adequate condition. We can't afford to feed those in a year like this if they don't need it. And just thinking about how strategic do I get in my culling? I will argue in any year, but especially in a drought year, every one of us have 10%, 15%, 20% of our cows at the bottom end of the spectrum that are costing us money and that we're losing money on. Getting rid of that bottom 15% in a normal year makes us more profitable. Definitely in a drought year, it makes us more profitable. And I realize there's implications of fall versus spring calvers. I always detest sending a cow to the market if she's an older cow and I know she's going to, go to slaughter if she's in the third period. So maybe this is the time that you try to get that calf out of them and then roll them early, or late fall, something like that. There's different implications for those, but I think we really have to look at all the things that are on the table for management that we can do to just get through this coming winter. But I go back to this slide of the cow numbers and think about where we are going on cow numbers. And, I've raised this issue with other analysts. I think this could be really, really interesting that this recent cow cycle has been up and down, here in this last 8 to how long is it going to take us before we bottom out? I think one of the interesting things is when cows got to $3,000 in 14 and 15, and we saved heifers that could have been sold for $3 a pound, so $1,500 straight off of their mama. How many people did you hear say 2 years later, when that $1,500 heifer as a weaned calf was calving in and she was only worth $1,600 to $1,800 at that time, and those $3,000 cows had dropped to $1,600 to $1,800? How many people did you hear say, boy, if cows would just get back up to $2,500 or $3,000, I think I'd sell a bunch of them, or I might just choose to retire? I think this time psychologically may be different for us, in the standpoint that I'm not so sure we rush out to save heifers and grow the cow herd quite as quickly as we did in the last cattle cycle. Not only that, not only psychologically, but as I said, the cost of production is simply much higher than it was 10 years ago as well. But I think psychologically it could have some impacts. So where we're forecasting that number could go down if producers don't respond to those higher calf prices and start growing the cow herd, going into expansion, we could push that number even lower and push prices even higher going forward. So, it's something to think about long term. I don't know where it's going, but it's just an interesting thought process. Now, this is one of the tools that Stacey Hamilton showed a couple weeks ago or a month ago at one of the earlier town hall meetings here. And I don't want you to read too much into the whether it's buy hay or fertilize at a certain level. I just want to show a concept here because, this chart really does depend on how much, how many pounds of forage for each pound of nitrogen I apply. What I put in is the energy content of the hay, and what I put in is the energy content of the stockpile. Really makes a lot of difference. So I don't want you to worry about if a cell is green versus white. Okay. But I wanted to show just one thing from this chart. If I say that of my stockpile that I grow, that I'm going to consume 50% of that, I'm going to let the cows kind of roam around, and I'm going to do a decent job of consumption, but I'm not going to get all of my stockpile consumed because they're going to walk on some and they're going to defecate on some, and I'm going to waste a little bit of that. If I consume 50% of my stockpile, which realize a really high level of utilization is 70 to 75%. We don't ever go beyond that. So if I consume a pretty good amount of my stockpile at 50%, but if I improve that just by 15%, if I go to 65% utilization of my stockpile, which is very possible with strip grazing, look what happens to the difference of the recommendation from the spreadsheet versus buy hay versus fertilize. At $1 a pound for my nitrogen, that extra 15% of utilization basically means I'm better off to fertilize even down below $120 a ton of hay, versus if I drop that 15% extra utilization, then now I'm better off to buy hay all the way up to $160 a ton. And again, I don't want you to look at is the cell green versus white. I just want you to look at what a little bit of improvement in utilization, a little bit of improvement in my management, how quickly it changes the numbers. And so, one of the things I think about is every fall when we have drought, people rush to say, can I plant rye? Can I plant turnips? Can I plant oats? What can I plant? When the reality is just a little bit of polywire and doing some strip grazing often can improve my utilization and make me just as much money as anything. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Again, as I said, 2 rolls of polywire and a couple armfuls of step-in post can allow me to do a better job of managing the grass that I'm already growing. I mentioned investing in infrastructure. What about the bale rings that we're using? If I invest in better bale rings and decrease my hay waste by 5% or 10%, what is that worth today? Well, 10% better utilization of my hay is a good thing when hay is $40 or $50 a bale. When hay is $90 or $100 a bale, 10% waste reduction is huge. I haven't heard a lot of people talking about pH and liming, and I realize it's almost getting too late for that, not too late for next year, but to get too late to think about, what I'm going to grow this fall, depending on where you're at and how much fertilizer I'm going to put on. But, are we concerned about spending $1 per unit on nitrogen when maybe we're not even getting the full benefit of that nitrogen that we're applying because our pH is not where it needs to be? Again, I think this is a time to think about investing in infrastructure. The other thing, I threw this chart in just to show, this is the heavyweight feeder steers, the 700 to 800 pounders. Have you noticed lately in the market how dramatically those heavyweight steers have run up in price, even more aggressively than the lightweight steers, the lighter calves? Maybe going forward, because I'm maxing out my cow numbers, if maybe this is a time that my cost of production is higher, rather than running 50 cows, could I run 40 cows and background my calves to heavier weights when the market is clearly telling me they want heavier weight calves based on higher corn prices? Can I be more profitable if I run 40 cows and background my calves instead of running 50 cows, or run 75 cows instead of 100? I think we need to look long term at how I build a more resilient farm and protect myself from more droughts going forward and make a more efficient and more profitable farming operation. Again, I want to remind you, we got 220 days till spring, but I think the more challenging thing is not just to look at my cost of getting through this winter, but what is my cost of production going to be beyond 2022? I think now is really the time to get our house in order, to make some strategic decisions about culling and making sure that I'm being as most efficient as possible. Now may be the time to invest in infrastructure, invest in rotational grazing, invest in feeding facilities, invest in something that's going to make me more efficient and more profitable going forward. And I just cannot underscore how important it is to focus on management this year. Management is always important, but with higher cost and higher feed cost, management becomes so much more important to being profitable going forward. With that, there is my contact information. If anyone has any questions that they don't want to share because they're watching online on YouTube or something like that, feel free to reach out. But I will pause and ask Druba and Patrick if there's any questions from the audience today.
There is no any question so far.
If not, then I will turn it back to you, Patrick.
Yep. Thank you, Wesley, for that talk and that presentation. And with that, let me finish this out. So as we wrap this up, I mentioned earlier, but the MUIPM YouTube page has this one as well as previous livestock and forage hour meetings on it. And so if you want to scroll through those and look at anything related to those, it's there. Also, I did want to talk about the upcoming meeting for September 22nd. Dr. Eric Bailey, our MU Extension State Beef Cattle Nutrition Extension Specialist, will talk about cattle culling strategies. And so that will be at noon on September 22nd. And also want to thank you all for being on today. And if you have any questions related to forage, livestock, and you want those questions answered by the group that plans these meetings, you can register for future meetings at the ipmmissouri.edu town halls website. And through that registration process, you can ask that question and we'll either answer it during the presentation or we will contact you individually and answer that question. And so with that, thank you all for being on today, and hopefully we'll see you on the 22nd for our next town hall or our next livestock and forage hour meeting.